Hi guys, welcome everyone. I'm going to give people a few minutes to sort of get settled. Hi everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces. I'm going to give everybody until like 7:04, 2 more minutes, and then I'll start, okay? If you guys have any questions before we start, you can throw them into the chat. Can everyone hear me and see the screen? Okay, perfect. Okay, so it seems like people have sort of stopped joining, so I'm just going to go ahead and start to save us time. So hi guys, my name is Olga. I think most of you guys know me. I've taught this Hunter course before, just a few weeks ago in January, and this is sort of a rerun of that. Now that they've announced that the test is coming up. It's going to be a 3-day sort of mass review of everything. We're going to be working out of the first Hunter exam that's released. I can give everybody the link just so everybody has the test that we're working from as well. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to put it in the chat for everyone. This is the test that we're working from. I just put it in the chat, so everybody should have it available to them. And then this 3-day course is going to run through the reading section today, the math section tomorrow, and then we'll do the essay on Thursday. And like always, I'm always available for you guys to answer any questions. And I'm going to put my email into the chat right now too, so you guys can take it down. And you can email me questions. You can email me request for the notes, and then I'll reply back and I'll send the notes from these sessions as well. And we are also recording, so hopefully we'll be able to get you guys those as well. All right, does anybody have any questions before we start? Okay, so if you guys have any questions, please just put them into the chat, and I'll do my best to monitor the chat as we're sort of going through. The settings are set such that you guys can't unmute yourself, just to make sure that the class can run smoothly. So make sure that you're utilizing the chat for any questions or concerns that you guys have, okay? And I'll do my best to keep monitoring it, all right? All right, any questions before we sort of get going? Okay, great. So we're gonna start with the first reading passage. The way that I want to run this is I want to read these with you out loud, and I want to show you guys kind of what my thought process is as I'm reading through the passage, for you guys to sort of emulate that as you read through the passages. And there's different strategies depending on the types of passages that we're reading. So the main thing that we want to think about is whether or not we're reading a nonfiction passage or a fiction passage. So a narrative passage or a structured nonfiction passage. And then I also want to do a little bit of poem strategies with you guys as well. So the first thing is I want to take some notes on just general tips for reading comprehension, and then I'm going to go ahead and open up with this passage and show you guys how to read, okay? So let's start reading this together, and then I'll flip and I'll show you guys some notes that we can take down for strategies, okay? Okay, so the first thing that I do whenever I see a reading passage is I always annotate all of my passages. Sometimes the passages will come with a little blurb and a title. We always want to read that. So you want to read all the information that the test makers are giving you. It's all used for you to be able to put the pieces together like a puzzle, and then be able to answer the questions correctly. In this case, we don't have a title and we don't have a blurb. So we're going to go ahead and go directly into reading it. The title and the blurb is even more important if you guys are reading a fictional passage like a narrative or a poem. So in those cases, that's even more, I want to emphasize that even more. In this case, we don't have any of that. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to just start reading from the first paragraph. So as I start reading, I see, as I walked home from church with my mother that day. So even before I finish reading the whole first sentence, I already have a clue of the point of view of this passage. So what I mean by that is we have pronouns and we see the personal pronouns. We see I and we see my. So what this is telling me is that this passage is written by a first person narrative. So somebody is telling me their personal story, personal. And I know that just from seeing the personal pronouns. So the first thing that I'm going to point out here is I'm going to see that this is written from first person point of view. How do we know that? We look at pronouns and we see personal pronouns, things like I, me, my. From there, that's suggesting to me that this is a personal story, that I'm like somebody is going to tell me something personal that happened in their lives. So that's already structuring me of what kind of thing I'm reading and what kind of questions they can ask me based on that. So we know that the narrator is telling us the story. Okay. So as I walked home from church with my mother that day, the streets seemed as quiet and safe as her eyes. Okay, so now I'm going to underline as quiet and safe as her eyes. And who can tell me why I'm paying attention to that? What is as quiet and safe as her eyes? What kind of figurative language is that? Yeah, perfect. So I see the answers coming into the chat. This is a simile. So on this test, especially when we do the essay session, you guys will see that this exam loves figurative language. So it's our job to sort of be able to point out the figurative language as we come across it. And it's very likely that they'll ask us this in a question. So we have a simile here. A simile is a comparison using like or as. So in this case, we obviously have an as here, and we're comparing the streets to his mom's smile or her mom's smile, whoever is telling us this story. And the other thing that I want you guys to think about whenever you see figurative language or comparison is think, is this positive or is this negative? So is the author trying to say something positive about the streets and comparing them to his mom's eyes, or something negative? And in this case, clearly it's positive. And the way that we know that is we have positive words, like safe is positive. Quiet can be neutral, but safe is telling me that this is positive. So now this is telling me two things. This is first telling me that he feels safe on the street, but it also tells me like a positive thing about his relationship with his mom, that he feels safe in his mom's vision and eyes. Does that make sense? So just from this one line, we can extract all of this information. So that's what you guys have to get good at with reading comprehension, is just extracting, pulling out all of this information from the passage. Okay, let's keep going. So how suddenly tempting it seemed to me, this quest and this safety compared to the place where I was going. So now we have sort of this line of the author seems to be at like a dichotomy, right? So now it seems like they get to choose the safety versus where they're going. So now this is kind of telling us, okay, what is opposed to the safety? Where is the author potentially going? And the next line is going to expose it to us. For I had decided to run away from my home and my mother that afternoon down to the harbor to see the world. What would become of me way down there? What would she do if I never came back? So this line of questioning is called rhetorical questioning, which is another type of figurative language device that I want you guys to know. A rhetorical question is when we, or the author, figuratively, you can do this in your essay as well, provide a list of questions. And the questions are not meant to be literal and they're not meant to be answered. They're just meant to take you sort of down a thought process. So in this case, the author is kind of ruminating, like what would happen to me way down there? So first pay attention to these quotations, and way down there is obviously referring to the harbor, but it's interesting to see why they put things in quotations. And then what would she do if I never came back? A lump rose in my throat at the thought of her in tears. It was terrible. So the author is kind of like not foreshadowing, but he's ruminating on all of these thoughts. He's reflecting and they're thinking, okay, what would happen if I never came back? And they're imagining how upset their mom would be. And that is making them feel not good, obviously. A lump rose in my throat is, I'll talk about this a lot when we do the essay lesson, but this is the narrator showing rather than telling us, right? He's showing us how that would make them feel rather than telling us like, oh, that would make me sad. A lump rose in my throat is showing that they're sad. Okay, all the same, I'm going to do it. So despite feeling all this, like all of these rhetorical questions, all of this uncertainty, despite thinking, like feeling sad at the end of the day, imagining their mom in tears, they still decide all the same, I'm going to do it. So this is showing me sort of the narrator's personality trait. We see that the narrator is persistent. And then we see I kept thinking doggedly. So this is kind of telling me likely doggedly probably means something similar to persistent, because despite all of these second thoughts and despite all of these maybes, uncertainties, they still decide all the same, I'm going to do it. And all the same is another word that's kind of similar to persistent, another phrase that's supporting that. And yet suddenly, as we reached our front steps, how near I came to telling her. But no, she would only spoil it all. She wanted me up, always in the garden. She never wanted me to have any thrills. Okay, so he thought about telling her, and then they decided no, spoil it all. So by spoil it all, likely here the narrator means she wouldn't let him go. She wouldn't let this happen. And then the narrator explains it a little bit of the mom always wanted him close up in the garden. She never wanted me to have any thrills. So in this case, for him, being able to run away and see the harbor is thrilling, and his mom always wanted him home safe. Okay, any questions so far based on the first two paragraphs that I read, what I paid attention to, why I paid attention to it, or anything like that? No, you guys are good? Somebody said, is this tone? What do you mean by this? There's definitely aspects of tone within the first two paragraphs that we've pointed out. Yeah, asking rhetorical questions is part of tone. The whole thought process of seeing the narrator sort of think back and forth and how the narrator ultimately comes to their decisions is all part of tone. That's a good question. Okay, so let's keep reading. Let's go to the next paragraph. So now we have, my mother knew me so well. She had seen that when she read stories of fairies, witches, and goblins out of my books to Sue and me, while Sue, though 2 years younger, would sit there like a little dark imp, her black eyes snapping over the fights, I would creep softly out of the room, ashamed and shaken, and would wait in the hall outside till the happy ending was in plain view. So up until here, first we meet a new character. So we have Sue, which hasn't been introduced to us before. So that's definitely something that you want to pay attention to. Any new name. So we have a new character. So that's one thing that we want to pay attention to. And then they tell us, they define us who they give us a hint, right? They say 2 years younger. So it implies that likely Sue is the narrator's little sibling. And then I underline this like a dark little imp because we have another simile here, right? He's comparing Sue, his sister, to a dark little imp. So we have another comparison here, and we're using the word like, so that's how I know it's a simile. And then we have a lot of imagery, right? I would creep softly out of the room, ashamed and shaken. So we have a lot of imagery, a lot of adjectives here that I would point out as well. So my mother had gradually toned down all of the fights and the killings, the witches and the monsters, and much to my disappointment, had wholly shut out the gory pirates, who were for me the most frightfully fascinating of all. So the mom is noticing that her kid is reacting to these scary stories. So the mom is adapting and she's taking out all these scary things out of the stories. And then notice here, I underlined frightfully fascinating. So we have two things. Frightfully fascinating, first of all, is a little bit of alliteration, because we're repeating the same consonant sound back to back. But it's also a little bit of like an oxymoron as well, because something is both frightful and fascinating. So the two words are almost like opposites of each other. So that's definitely another literary device that we want to point out as well. Gonna keep reading. So we have sometimes I felt vaguely that for this she had had her own reason too, that my mother hated everything that had to do with the ocean, especially my father's dock that made him so gloomy and silent. But of this I could never be quite sure. I would often watch her intently with a sudden sharp anxiety, for I loved my mother with all of my soul, and I could not bear to see her unhappy. So now we mentioned this dock or this harbor up in the first paragraph. And we have a little bit of a theme coming up because first of all, they call the harbor like way down there, which is an interesting term. It's kind of negative. And then we learn that the mom never wanted him to go down there. And then in this third paragraph, we are sort of exploring further the relationship with the mom with the harbor, why she doesn't want her kids going down there. He goes so far as to say that his mom hated everything that had to do with the ocean. And then we find out that why he potentially wants to go to the harbor, because it has to do with his father, which we didn't know before. And then it also ends with just understanding the relationship between the son and the mom. Because again, the son doesn't want to upset her, but he's ultimately still choosing to make this persistent choice and go down there anyways. But we constantly see this theme of the son caring about his mom a lot and not wanting to upset her. And that's how this paragraph ends as well. Okay, so then we have never on any account, I heard her say to Belle, are the children to go down the street towards the docks. Yes, ma'am, said Belle, I'll see to it. So here is a little bit of, we get like dialogue. And the point of the author including this dialogue is to make his point. Here is his mom talking to this new character, Belle, which is potentially their like babysitter caretaker. We're not sure who she is, but she's giving her clear instructions that the kids are never to go down there. And then Belle is agreeing. So this is just furthering this sentiment the narrator has that the mom does not like the ocean. The mom does not let them go down there. But it seems to have the opposite effect because it says, at once I wanted to go down there. The street in front of our house sloped abruptly down the next corner 2 blocks through poorer and smaller houses to a cobblestone space below, over which trucks clattered plainly on their way to the docks. So I could go down and around by that way. How tempting it all looked down there. So despite his mom really doing her best and sort of not trying to prevent the kids from going there, ultimately it backfired because he still wants to go there and he's persistent. Despite this relationship that he has with his mom that's strong, despite caring for his mom's feelings, he's still persistent that ultimately he still wants to go down to the docks. And this is sort of the narrative piece, the takes away from this narrative piece. Okay, does anybody have any questions about this first passage before we look at the questions together? Any vocabulary for me to define or any literary devices, anything like that? Somebody asked, what does imp mean? So imp is kind of like it's like a mythological being. It means like a little mischievous, like being, like almost like a little like devil. It has a little bit of like a mischievous negative connotation to it. Good question. Anybody else have any questions before we take a look at the multiple choice? Okay, so let's do the multiple choice together. So it says the comparison that the narrator makes between the streets and his mother's eyes suggests that he finds the streets on that day to be blank. So this comparison is the simile that we pointed out. So remember when we talked about the simile, I asked you guys, do we think that this is a positive comparison or do we think that this is a negative comparison? And just being able to break it down into positive or negative is enough to help us eliminate choices. So I want you guys to go back and reread this comparison. The streets seemed as quiet and safe as her eyes. And tell me what answer you think is best. Just put it in the chat. Perfect. So the answers are coming in, and so far everybody has got it correct. So the answer is B, comforting. And the way that we know that is the street seemed as quiet and safe as her eyes. So safe is a positive word. We're trying to say something positive about the street. And safe and comforting are almost synonyms. So one thing that you'll hear me say a lot is match the language in the passage to the language in the answer choices. And you guys can see the connection between safe and comforting, both positively connotated words and both almost synonymous. Now, if we look at the answer choices, some things that we can eliminate right away is dark, because dark is a negative word. And we're trying to say that the street is comforting. And if we think about a dark street, that's more when I would be describing like a scary street, a street that you feel unsafe walking down. So exactly the opposite of what he's trying to say. And then the other sort of strategy that I want to impart onto you guys is eliminate answer choices that are very similar to each other. So for example, passive and indifferent are almost synonymous. They kind of mean not this way, not that way, right? They're what we would call net neutral words. And that would help us eliminate either of those. And then exciting, if we think about words like on a scale, exciting is a little bit too much, right? We're not trying to evoke excitement. We're trying to evoke comfort, safety. Excitement is a little bit of a different definition entirely. Does that make sense to you guys? So again, just for you guys to think about the thought process, you want to think about the comparison that you're given. You're comparing streets to a mother's eyes. And the comparison is the quiet and the safety of the streets. And I want you to think to yourself, is these positive attributes or negative attributes? And pick the answer choice that's most similar to those words that you're using in the comparison. And in this case, comforting is most similar to safe. Is that clear? Okay, so now let's go on to the next question. So the next question is another one that we kind of discussed as we were reading. It's what this word doggedly means. And if you guys remember, the word doggedly was used in this context. All the same, I'm going to do it. So that's what came right before it. And this was in the context of the narrator telling us that he may be having some second doubts about doing something, but then he decides, all the same, I'm still going to do it. So, like I said before even looking at this, the attribute that's giving us is persistence. And that's why A is the best answer here. Good. I see all you guys putting A in the chat. Anybody was thinking about a different choice? No, nobody was thinking about a different choice? So if we look at the options here, I think maybe the only option that you guys could be considering is fearfully, because perhaps he was like afraid to disappoint his mom, but it's a bit of a stretch. There was nothing that directly suggested that. And then all the other options, there's nothing to suggest loudly or tiredly or dreamily. So anytime you guys pick an answer choice, there should be a reason why you pick it. You should be able to go back in the passage and imagine that I'm standing over you and tell me this is why I picked that. So all the same is one reason to pick persistently. The second reason is the context clues of what he was talking about in the beginning. Okay, let's look at number 3. So number 3 says, the narrator decides not to tell his mother his plans to run away because she would blank. So this is a little bit of a go back into the passage and find the answer question. So this is a detailed question. They tell us in the passage. So who can tell me what line is the answer in? What line I can bring back here? So the answer is in the second paragraph. And it's at this point where the narrator says, how near I came to telling her, but no, she would only spoil it all. Yeah, good. So line 8, line 9 is where we have the answer. So the direct quote is, she would only spoil it all. And excellent. I see you guys already putting in the answer, choice C. Again, the name of the game is to match the language in the passage to the language in the answer choices. And spoil it all and ruin them are again synonymous. So you guys are going to catch up on the pattern of this, where all we have to do is just match the answer in the passage to the language that they use in the passage to similar language in the answer choice. Now, if we look at the options, be very angry with him. So I think that this is a reasonable choice if you can infer this, right? You can infer that the mom would be upset with him or angry with him. But the question is specifically asking us what's the narrator's point of view? And the direct quote said she would only spoil it all. So that's what we're picking. Does that make sense? So I think A is reasonable. But A would only be a good answer if it was an inference question. So you guys have to get good at figuring out what is the category of question. Do they want you to guess? Do they want you to make an educated inference? Or do they want you to, is this testing just your reading comprehension, being able to go back into the passage and find a specific detail? Now, what I'll tell you guys is inference questions are very uncommon on the Hunter exam, and in at this level, most of the questions are likely to be detail questions, but there will be at least one question for every 2 passages that is an inference question, and those are usually more difficult. But the way that you know it's an inference question is they will directly tell you what can you infer or what does the author suggest. That's another keyword. Infer or suggest tells you that, okay, maybe it won't be directly written, you have to read between the lines. Other than that, this question specifically says the narrator decides to do this because blank. So that's a direct detail question, which tells me to go back into the passage and find the direct answer. Does that make sense? And then if we look at the other options, tell Sue, there's nothing in the passage at that point about telling Sue. We were not even introduced to Sue yet at that point. So that's an unlikely choice that we should be able to eliminate. And then make him do the gardening. So this is, they're trying to trick you because right after that, they're saying how the mom always wanted him in the garden, but that's not a literal thing. She doesn't want him in the garden to literally garden. She just wants him in the garden to be close to home. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, good. All right, so let's keep going. So the next question says the description of Sue's black eyes snapping over the fights in the books that their mother would read to them implies that Sue is blank. So infer, suggest, imply is another one where they're not going to directly tell us. So this is an example of an inference question. So what do you guys think? And give me a little bit of why also, if you can, in the chat. Yeah, excellent. So everybody's putting in that the answer is E. Yes, and I have some people are saying the word snapping is helping them think of feisty. And somebody else said because of the comparison to a dark imp. Yeah, because of she likes the violence, she likes the gore. Excellent. So all of these are good details to point to match the language to feisty. Excellent. So kind of means that she's more like, she likes the action, she likes the fighting. That's what the word feisty sort of suggests in this case. If we look at the options, I think definitely not afraid, right? Because she's enjoying this. So I think afraid is the one that you could directly sort of cancel out. And then sad and unintelligent and mean. How do we get rid of those? Well, unintelligent in this context doesn't make any sense. We're not testing her intelligence. It's just a matter of like your taste in different stories. So this is sort of not really relevant. And then sad, I would call it the opposite because her black eyes are snapping over the fight in excitement. It's a positive connotation. So I would eliminate sad. And then I think mean is the hardest one to eliminate because some students might conflate the idea that she likes these violent, scary stories with the fact that she's mean. But I think that would be like an over inference. It's like you're jumping to the conclusion a little bit too much, right? So there's not enough evidence for us to make that leap. There's nothing in the story that makes her mean. Just because she likes like scary, violent stories doesn't suggest that she's a mean person. Feisty is a safer option here. Does that make sense? So this is an over leap. So over time, once you guys do enough of this, you're sort of going to see what kind of fake answer choices or trap choices the authors put into the options for you guys. And for me, it's clear to see that mean is that trap choice, that choice that if you over assume, that's what you would pick. Does that make sense? So you always want to question yourself when you're picking that, like, is this too big of an assumption? Is there a little bit of a safer answer choice? And in this case, feisty is definitely the safer answer choice. Any questions? All right, good. All right, let's look at number 5. So we have the narrator compares himself to Sue in order to highlight his blank. So whenever we have a comparison where we have two different things, right? So the way that you can think of it is like a Venn diagram, like sometimes we use in math. So we want to emphasize the differences, right? Emphasize differences. That's what the word compare is for. If you ever see them use contrast, this is more to think about like similarities. But compare means they're telling us to look at the differences. So the differences, we were just talking about Sue. Sue she likes violence, right? All of these words that you guys were giving me in the chat. We called her an imp. She likes the gore. And then from that answer choice, we ultimately decided that she's feisty. And if we're comparing the narrator to that, he's the one that walks out of the room when he hears all these scary stories. So he's the opposite of all of these. So I'm looking for an answer choice that's the opposite of all of these. So instead of feisty, instead of somebody that has a thing for like violence and scary stories, scary movies, he's the opposite. He's a little bit more sensitive. Now, if we look at the options, definitely not youth, right? Because he's older than Sue. So there's a detail that tells us that the narrator is older than Sue. So we should be able to eliminate B. Everybody should be able to eliminate B because that's a direct detail they told us in the passage. Now, the next choice, indifference, is just not true based on his disposition. So he cares a lot. If he was indifferent, then he wouldn't have to leave the room, right? So the context clue of him leaving the room tells us that he is sensitive to the stories, right? They have an effect on them. Otherwise, he wouldn't care. So indifference is definitely not it either. And then easygoing disposition is not relevant in this case so much. There's nothing that tells us that Sue isn't easygoing, and sneakiness as well. is not really relevant. There's nothing that suggests, there's no details that suggest that he's sneaky versus his sister not being sneaky or anything like that. Okay, so let's go to the next question. So the next one, the narrator's feelings about the gory pirates in line 15 can best be described as blank. So, sorry, let's go back to line 15 and see what his feelings are. And his feelings are these words that we already highlighted: frightfully fascinating. Yes, excellent. So the answer in this case is B. So we want to match the language of both frightfully and fascinating, right? So frightful matches with scared, matching the language in the passage to the answer. Frightful matches with scared, and then fascinating matches with intrigued. So with this question, I want to just make a point to teach you guys about all of the above answer choices. So you want to be really careful with all of the above answer choices because they're a little bit of a trap. As soon as you find one choice that you're not 100% on, it's likely not all of the above. So even if two choices seem really, really good, but the other two seem really, really bad, I don't want you guys to fall into the trap of all of the above. So you have to be very confident to pick an all of the above answer. It's very unlikely for the answer to be all of the above. So I want to make you guys very careful before you pick that answer. If we look at these other choices, angry but hopeful, thoughtful but careless, wary but disinterested are all kind of, none of them are saying the same thing. So it would be very difficult for the answer here to be all of the above because none of these are synonyms with each other. Does that make sense? And then if we look at some of the answer choices, for example, wary is close enough to frightfully or scared, kind of means that you're like cautious, but then disinterested is not positive enough, right? The key here is that we have one kind of negative word, being afraid or being scared, and then we have a positive word. But in this case, wary is like a little bit of a negative word and disinterested is still negative. Does that make sense? So I think that's the choice that could have tricked you guys, and that's why I want to explain why that's not it. And then finally, last but not least, I thought this one was a fairly simple one, even though it is an inference question because we have the word suggest here. So the father's occupation definitely has something to do with the sea, correct? We have all of these hints with the ocean, with the harbor. So all of these hints that they give us in the passage. And then I think there's a direct line, father's dock, which is another sort of hint. All right, so we did it. We went through the first passage. I want to take a minute to answer any particular questions about this passage or the questions or how we went through it or anything like that. Somebody asked where these questions are coming from earlier. So these questions are from a real released Hunter exam. This is the first released Hunter exam of this year. Here's a link again, just whoever missed it and joined late, just so you guys have it. All right, so if there's no questions, before we go to the next passage, I want to take a second because the next passage is a poem. So I want to take a few minutes to give you guys some notes about reading comprehension strategies in general, and then give you guys some notes about poems, and then we'll do the next poem. Somebody said, what does feisty mean? So feisty kind of means like you're full of like energy in a way, like uncertain, like a little bit aggressive energy, like you're feisty, you're a little bit sassy, you're lively. It can be used in like both a positive and negative connotation, but I think most of the time it's more of like a good thing. Like it's not meant to be like a mean connotation. Does that help? Like, oh, you're a feisty one, like you're a little bit sassy, you're a little bit alive, like you're a little bit loud. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay, so let's take a few minutes to do some notes on reading comprehension tips and then on poetry tips, okay? And I want you guys to try to follow along and copy the notes just because that's studying in and of itself as you guys write the notes. Things get imprinted into your mind and your memory. But like I said, I'm more than happy to send out the notes if you guys email me after the class. So don't be stressed if you're not like catching everything. Okay, so let's do tips for reading comp. So first I want to talk about what if you're reading like a story, like either a fictional piece or a narrative piece. So not like a nonfiction journal article. So in this case, one of the things that I want you guys to look at is I want you to pay attention to the plot. So quite literally, the plot is what is going on. So the events. So if we bring that back to this story or narrative that we just read, the events is sort of the narrator formulating this plan to run away. And throughout those events, we learn about the different characterizations and the different relationships the characters have with one another, which is going to be a whole separate category that I'm going to mention. Now, the other thing that comes with plot is oftentimes we hit sort of like a peak in the plot. So we call that the climax or the turning point. So not every single story is going to have this. In this story, we kind of don't get to the climax or turning point. And here, the climax or turning point would potentially be when the narrator actually does run away. So it's like a big part of the story that the whole story is building up to. Sometimes because they give you excerpts, we'll never actually hit that part, but it's important to think like, what is this leading up to? So in this narrative that we read, it was leading up to the narrator actually doing it, actually running away, and then what happens then. So that's another thing that I want you guys to think about. Now, through the plot, through the events that go on, we also meet different characters in the story. So that's another thing. So the next thing is character development. So one is, who are the characters? What role do they play? So if we bring this sort of aspect back to this story that we just read, we have a few characters. So we have the narrator, who we don't know by name, but he or she's the one telling us the story. Then we have the narrator's mom, and then we have Sue. And then tangentially, they're barely mentioned in the story, but they are still characters. We have the narrator's father, and we have the potential caretaker. I think Belle was her name. So the three characters, especially the narrator, he's or she is like our main character. We learn a lot about them because the story is told from their point of view. So we kind of get to see how their brain works, how their thoughts work, what's important to them. So we learn a lot about the narrator through his actions and through the way that he's thinking about things. So he's thinking about how his actions would upset his mom. That's telling us that he cares about his mom. That's also telling us between the relationship between him and his mom. So not only do we want to know about the characters, what role they play in the story, but we also want to know how they change and how their relationships develop, which is everything that we saw in this story. And one of the things that can help us a lot with this and how the characters are sort of changing or developing, and also the relationship between the characters, is dialogue. So how do they communicate? What kind of language are they using when they talk to each other? So for example, even if you use sir or ma'am, that can tell us sort of the relationship between the characters, whether it's a formal relationship or informal, how close the characters are, and the context of what are they communicating as well. And this is also kind of showing us the difference between what a narrator can think versus what they actually say out loud and communicate with the other characters. And obviously, the way that we look at dialogue is quotes. Now, the other thing that I want to point out that I did with this this story is point of view. So this is one of the first things that you guys can take a look at. So this is going to tell us who is telling us the story. And the main points of view that you guys should think about at your level is either first person or third person. First person is going to give us all the personal pronouns that I pointed out before, like I, me, and my. And then third person is other, somebody else telling you about their story. So you're going to get third person pronouns like they, like she, like he, like it. And then some other miscellaneous things that I want you guys to pay attention to always whenever we're reading is setting. So think about the time and the place that the story is taking place. Not always obvious, but if it is obvious, then something that you want to like pay attention to. And then other things is sometimes there's going to be like a moral or a lesson to these stories. Again, this is another thing like climax where this doesn't always happen because they're just giving you like a little smidge, like an excerpt. So sometimes we'll never get to the moral of the lesson, but if there's like a big conclusion, usually it's because the story taught us something. And that's basically what I want you guys to think about whenever we read narratives or fictional stories. So somebody said, can you tell us about the different types of fictional passages? So most of what you'll be given is fictional or narrative passages, right? So if there's any sort of characterization, like characters, if there's any quotes, if it's taken from like a book, all of that falls under the category of fictional stories. The only sort of nonfiction passage you'll be given is if it's written like a newspaper or journal article, and if it's on like a particular scientific thing. Like if it's like a little article on global warming, for example. And in those cases, it's not going to be like any of this stuff. It's not going to be, you wouldn't have to consider if it's first person or third person or what's the plot, because it's going to be very clear. It's going to be structured like a journal article. There's going to be a clear thesis statement. There's going to be like a clear argument that the author's sort of trying to get across versus these sort of fictional or narrative stories, which are more soft and up to your interpretation. Does that make sense? So while we're talking about that, let's do a little page for nonfiction, and then let's do poems and read the next poem together. So again, when you get a nonfiction, I want you to think about it as like an article. I want you to think very dry, very structured. So the key word here is structured. So what's going to be here is a clear thesis statement. And it's going to be found in the same place every time. It's going to be found at the end of the first paragraph. And then we're going to have topic sentences. And each paragraph is going to open with the topic sentence. And each topic sentence is going to support the thesis. And then after that, each body paragraph will have supporting details that support the topic sentence. So 3 will be supporting details. And then finally, you're going to have a conclusion, which is going to restate your thesis. So we are going to have a whole separate lesson on a poem. I mean, sorry, not on a poem, I misspoke, on the essay portion. But just to kind of get your head rolling, like in the right direction, preparing for Thursday's lesson, I want to show you how your essay will use the similar structure to accomplish your essay. So, for example, if I want to write an essay about why New York City is meaningful to me, which is a very common topic that the 100 tests like, and that's an essay that you guys should practice writing. I will open up my essay with something interesting like a hook, and then I'll write, and then I'm going to get to my thesis. And my thesis will be something like New York City or growing up in New York City. Shaped me as a person by exposing me to diversity and then we would think of, let's say, a second big thing. Does anybody have any ideas? What's important about New York City? By exposing me to diversity and let's say, and I don't know, architecture, something like that. So a lot of you guys are giving me really good ideas. So people are saying people from all over the world, people are saying cultural diversity, parks, buildings. So I want you guys, and I'll talk about this a lot in the essay, but in your thesis, you think about a really big umbrella. You want to be really broad. And then within your essay, once you get to your body paragraphs, once you get to your topic sentences, and then once you get to your supporting details, that's when you're going to be starting to list all the specific things. So through diversity, later on, we're going to write a whole paragraph on diversity. And when we're talking about diversity, that's when you can talk about diversity of people. You can talk about diversity of food. You can talk about being exposed to different cultures and going to public school and meeting all different types of people, or walking through the street and smelling all the different types of foods, or seeing just the diversity of, like, you can even talk about diversity of transportation. You could talk about anything that you want. And then in architecture, that's when you can talk about parks, and then you can talk about buildings. I mean, in some ways, diversity is a little bit even too broad, because you can talk about like diversity of buildings or diversity of anything. But the main idea that I want you guys to get across is, in your thesis, very broad, big words like diversity. That's going to spark a million different ideas in your heads. And then in the paragraphs, that's when you start doing all this specifics. And that's also when you would start doing showing rather than telling. So instead of just telling them like diversity of people, diversity of food, you're gonna cater to our senses, especially with food. You can cater to taste, to smell. You can paint the whole picture of like walking through and like all the halal carts and like all the fog from the halal carts and the scents on your tongue, and use all the metaphors and the figurative language that you can come up with. And we'll talk about that all on Thursday. But while we're talking about this, I just wanted this to sort of build a framework in your mind of how you want to start thinking about structuring those essays. Does that make sense to everyone? And on Thursday, we're going to do an essay lesson. I want to make sure or try to have time at the end to put some of your essays up on the screen, and they're going to be anonymous, obviously, and just so we can read them together and for me to sort of not necessarily grade them, but critique them, like tell you guys the positives and the negatives so you can see in real time in a real essay what's good and bad. So I know that Thursday is tight, but if you guys have an essay that you've been working on, or you've been wanting to write one, or you have an old one, not everybody, obviously, because there's like 30 of you guys here, we won't have time for everybody, but I'm going to try to put at least like 4 or 5 of them up so we can do that if you guys think that would be a helpful exercise. Okay, so let me quickly tell you guys about poems, and then I want to make sure that we have time to read that poem together, and then I'll let you guys go for the night. I definitely don't want to keep you late. Okay, let's do poem strategies. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do when we look at a poem is we want to look at the structure and the rhythm of a poem. So when I say structure, I mean like roast, like the general shape of the poem. What does the poem look like? So some poems just look like this. Some poems have more of a shape. So some poems can look like this on purpose. Some poems can look like a little squiggly line. I know I read a poem one time about a snake that I always reference and I don't forget, and it literally looked like a snake. So it's your job to sort of understand if the poem is just a regular shape of a poem, or if the author's trying to communicate to us something based on the shape of the poem. So just something to keep your eye out, to keep an eye out for. Because if the shape of the poem is something very obvious, like a snake, then that's obviously communicating to you what the poem is about. It's just an extra hint to you. It's like reading the title. And especially if the poem has an obvious shape, like something like this, that could be communicating something to you. If the poem has no shape, then we're out of luck. It's not giving us any extra information. The other thing that goes with structure and rhythm is you want to think about capitalization. So normally in the English language, we capitalize all proper nouns. So proper nouns are meant to be capitalized. Right? So these are things like names of people and places, cities, all of that is meant to be capitalized. But if we're capitalizing something random, like if we're saying, for example, if we're capitalizing mother, or if we're saying it was raining and we're capitalizing raining, usually the capitalization can be done for emphasis. Or it could be done for another method is personification, right? So another method is like respect, right? So in some cultures we say like mother son or something, and we capitalize like both mother and son, and mother son is almost like a god or a natural element or something like that. So either personification, where we're given human like qualities to something like mother son, or emphasis, or one of those techniques. So that's another thing to sort of pay attention to as you're reading. If something is capitalized and it's an improper noun, why? So other things that can be that the author can do to play on how things are written structure wise is things like punctuation. So is there a random period in the middle of a line? Is there a random semicolon? Is there a random period capital letter, random comma in the middle, or random break? Is this one line shorter than something else? Or stanzas, anything like that? So all of that falls under the umbrella of punctuation. So we can think about commas, we can think about stanza breaks. We can think about periods. And then the other thing is more basic things like italics or bolded, which we don't see often, but still want to include that here for completion. And then finally, the last thing that goes under structure is rhyming schemes. So sometimes every other line rhymes, sometimes every 2 things rhyme or every 4 things rhyme. And that's sort of up to you to notice. The main thing with rhyming schemes is noticing if the pattern is breaking for some reason, because if the pattern is breaking for some reason, the author is trying to communicate something there. So that's something that I would pay attention to. All right, so all of that goes under structure and rhythm. The next thing is comprehension, which is often the hardest thing for students. We actually have to understand what the poem is about, what they want us to take away. So the things that help with that is the title / any blurb that comes with it. This will oftentimes reveal to us what the topic is of the poem. The other thing that helps with it is pronouns. This helps us understand what the point of view is. Who is telling us the story? Similar to how I pointed it out in the narrative. So this is telling us who is telling us the story. And then finally, the last thing that help with comprehension is understanding literary devices. So just for time's sake, because I want to make sure that we complete the poem, I don't want to go into every single literary device right now, and we're going to do it more when I talk to you guys, like with the essay lesson on Thursday anyway. But just briefly, what are some literary devices that you guys know? Throw them into the chat. We talked about simile already. That came up in the narrative, 2 examples of a simile. What other literary devices do you guys know? Good, so a bunch is coming into the chat. So people are saying hyperbole. I see that come up in poems all the time. Hyperbole is an exaggeration. Somebody said personification. That's another really big one that comes up in poems all the time. That's another one that you guys should look for in poems. Personification is when we give human-like qualities to things that are not human. Metaphor, excellent. That's similar to a simile. It's a comparison, but we don't use like or as. Okay, good. Good. So you guys know some other ones. I'm just gonna mention verbally for now, and then I'll give you guys notes on it on Thursday. Is imagery, which is always used in poems. That's just like applying your senses, and we're gonna do a whole thing on that on Thursday as well, because it's really important that you guys use imagery in your essays. That's when you apply to your senses of smell, of sight, of touch, and you're just as descriptive as possible. Other ones you guys all mentioned: personification, hyperbole, irony, paradox, onomatopoeia. Good. Sure. So I can go back to this page for, let's say, 1 more minute, and then we're gonna go and read the poem together. So you guys can start reading the poem Slanted Figures, and then we're gonna read it together and do the questions. Let me know when I can flip the notes. Okay, let's do it. Let's do this poem. So the first thing that we have is slanted figures. So when I see slanted figures, it's kind of hard for you to know exactly the topic of what you could be reading about. But as we start reading, what I want you guys to do is always go back to the title and think, okay, are these the slanted figure? Like, why did the author call it slanted figures? What are the slanted figures? That's going to kind of answer our question of who are we reading about, or what are we reading about? Okay, so the slanted figures pushing west on Madison were leaning against air. So slanted figures pushing west on Madison were leaning against air. That's the first line of this poem. So one thing that I notice is this is capitalized, right? So now I have to ask myself, is this one of those special circumstances, or is it a proper noun? It's supposed to be capitalized. So Madison, to me, I'm thinking like almost like Madison Avenue. It sounds like a street. So it's the name of something. So it seems like this should be capitalized. That's normal. The author is not trying to do anything extra there. But now I know some slanted figures are pushing west on Madison, and those slanted figures are leaning against air. So now I'm thinking about like buildings maybe, or people, like something leaning against air. And then we are exposed to this element, the wind. And a lot of times, especially in the Hunter exam, the poems are about like elements of nature. And that's a lot of times of what's going to be personified too. So that's something that you guys should look for. So now I'm thinking slanted figures and I'm thinking wind, and the picture is kind of coming together, right? So the wind is probably whatever these figures are, whether they're buildings or people or whatever it is, I don't know. The wind is what's probably likely making them slanted. So the wind, my mother said, is terrible, her voice breaking inside that word. I was 5. Okay, so we have a lot of things happening here. So first we have my mother and we have I. So now we know the point of view is the narrator is telling us the story. It's a first person point of view. And it's this narrator recalling back from their memory and telling us this personal story. And we have some characters, right? We have his mom, or his or her mom, and we have this narrator. Marshall Field's department store was lost behind us. Again, notice the capitalization. It's a store, it should be capitalized. The wind had needle teeth. Its big flat hands were in my jacket, in my pants. Did I cry out? Okay, so here, what literary device is the author using? Does the wind really have teeth? Does the wind really have hands? What device are we using here? Excellent. Yes, this is personification. And like I told you guys, personification is extremely common for them to use it with natural elements. So we're personifying the wind. The wind doesn't literally have needle teeth. The wind doesn't literally have big flat hands. Did I cry out is also a rhetorical question, correct? And some people said metaphor. I think that you could also say a little bit this is a metaphor, because we're comparing the wind to like needle teeth. It's not literal. So you could also say that this piece is a little bit of a metaphor as well. That would fly as well. Excellent. So she led me in some stone wall spinning door up onto a sidewalk in the air, a protected crossing between office buildings. Suits and dresses stared at us. Okay, so here we have more personification, right? Because suits and dresses don't literally stare at them. So we're either personifying the outfits in this department store, or they were between office buildings. So potentially suits and dresses is like real people that are like staring at them thinking like, why did this random mom and son walk into their office? Okay, so we saved 2 blocks, she whispered as we took the escalator down, and then we had to cross the Chicago River, the Madison Strait Bridge. Some years, my mother said, they ran ropes down the stairs of these buildings to keep people from blowing away. Okay, so here we end up having some dialogue. So we're learning about sort of the relationship between this kid and their mom. So their mom is trying to protect them from the cold weather, right? So she got them inside, and she's telling them like historically it's always been so cold here, right? And historically she's just making conversation, right? They ran ropes down the stairs of these buildings to keep people from blowing away, showing how cold it really is. So this is another detail that's supporting how strong the wind is. And then we have the river thick as slush, but green. So thick as slush, what is this? What device is this? Excellent, right? It's a simile. We're comparing the river to slush, but we're using like or as. And then we have its ice mouth whispering. What is this? I already wrote it down. Personification, right? Because the river doesn't really have an ice mouth. Be careful, little boy, licked at what we walked on. The wind was in my shoes. So I think this is one of the harder lines in the poem, licked at what we walked on. So they're talking about they had to cross this bridge, right? And imagine this freezing cold river, right? It's ice mouth whispering, licked at what we walked on. So what I'm imagining is they're trying to paint this picture of the river is like almost like attacking with its cold tongue this bridge that they're walking on, right? Like they're imagining the tongue like attack, 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 attack as they're walking over this bridge, attacking them with the cold. So that's kind of the picture that this poem is trying to paint us, especially here. I think this is one of the harder lines to sort of take away. Okay, the wind was in my shoes. Again, personification, right? The wind wasn't literally in his shoes. And my mitten held my mother's glove. So basically, they were holding hands that held me to the earth and knew the way to the Chicago Northwestern Station. So again, here we get a little bit between the relationship between the narrator and the mom, where the narrator is sort of counting on the mom to get them to safety. Our feet were stumps, she said, inside as the train jerked, groaned, and rolled into darkness. So stumps meaning like they were so cold that they were like a tree stump, they couldn't move. And the train jerked, groaned, rolled into darkness. All of this is a little bit more personification, right? Because the train isn't literally groaning and rolling and jerking. Okay, calling out each, pausing in the dark. The conductor calling out each, pausing in the dark. I counted us homes. Chicago's furthest and still unshoveled corner, our snow was clean. Our house, its stucco white and tight opened. From behind our kitchen window, we saw other trains, lights sliding past the city, exhaling clouds of people into icy air. It's terrible out there, my mother said. I just won't thaw. So in this sort of last stanza in the poem, what we figure out is that they get home, and he's counting them home, right? So he's counting the stops, stops, and then finally they get home. And from their house, they can see all the other trains going past. And they're comparing that to the city exhaling clouds of people into icy air. So as the trains pass, it's like more people, the city is like breathing them out. It's just another figurative language here. And then it ends with the mom explaining how cold it really is out there. Okay, so we did it. We got through this poem. Does anybody have any questions between the figurative language or the things that I chose to point out, or any words for me to define before we look at the questions? Somebody said unshoveled. Unshoveled literally means like not shoveled. That's why they're saying the snow was clean. Yeah, so the question, good question. So somebody said, is the slanted figures the people? So ultimately, after reading this, I agree. I think the slanted figures are the people, slanted from the wind, from how cold it is. Excellent. Okay, so let's try to look at the questions. So that's what the first question is asking us. The people in stanza 1 are slanted figures because they are leaning into blank. So what are they leaning into? What's making them slanted? And where do I get the evidence for that? Excellent. So people are saying C. So the reason why we know that is if we go back into passage, it literally says we're leaning against air. Yes, perfect. So that's your evidence for a strong wind. I think that some of the fall answer choices here that they were trying to get you to fall for is a snowstorm. So I'd be really careful because we don't know that it's a snowstorm until way later on, and it might not even be a snowstorm. It might just be windy and the snow is old, just laying there from days ago. The other sort of hint that I'll give you, especially true in poems, but generally in all reading comprehension, is you should go in the order of the passage. So usually all of this is chronological. So if this first question is asking us about stanza 1, the answer is likely somewhere in stanza 1. So the snowstorm we don't hear about the snow until way later. So I would stay away from that answer choice. That's them trying to trick you. And then the other is the cold. It's obviously cold, but that's not literally what's making them lean. Specifically, it's the wind that's making them slanted figures. So that's what they're going for in this answer, in this question, rather. Okay, next one, in stanza 2, the suits and dresses stare at the mom because the mother and son are blank. So the suits and dresses, we talked about how that's either personification or it's possible that that's just the office employees that are staring at them. Yes, and you guys are telling me the answer is C, absolutely. That's because they're out of place. They're not supposed to go into that office building, right? They just went into the office building to get away from the freezing cold. So they don't belong there, obviously, they don't work there. So that's why the suits and dresses were kind of looking at them. Excellent. Any questions with this one? So shivering is not true anymore because now they were indoors. And then there's no evidence about them being poorly dressed. We don't really know how they're dressed. There's nothing that suggests that this is why they were staring at them. And then not necessarily because they were whispering. I think they were staring at them before they even started talking. And then appealing doesn't make sense in the context here. How can people be appealing in this way? Okay. Next, why does the mom speak to the son in stanza 2? So let's go back in the passage and find the 2 times the mom speaks to them. So first time she tells him that we saved 2 blocks. And then the second time she's telling him about how in the past years they had to run those ropes to keep people from flying away. So, and what's the similarity between both of those pieces of information? Yeah, excellent. So in both cases, she's kind of teaching him something. She's giving him information. Excellent. So she's definitely not trying to show off. And in neither of those cases is she trying to frighten him or make excuses for herself. So there's nothing, any of that. These are just simply facts that the son might not know before. I think the choice here that you guys could have fell for that I want to encourage you not to pick is this one, comfort him. So I think that this piece of information, we save 2 blocks, could be kind of comforting. But the second part is not comforting at all. The fact that they had to throw ropes to keep people from blowing away is kind of scary. So make sure that you're answering the question. In this case, they wanted you to think about both of the times that she spoke to him. So you want to find the similarity between both of these. So you can't only pick comfort him and think of we saved 2 blocks. You have to think about both of the times the mom chose to speak to the son and what the similarity was between both of those times. Okay. All right, next one. The boy describes the river as in stanza 2. Okay, so let's go back and see how the boy describes the river. So first he says the river thick as slush, it's ice mouth whispering. So thick as slush, ice mouth whispering. And then that line that I explained to you guys, looking at what we walked on. So all of those pieces definitely coming alive, right? We talked about how this is personification, which is by definition coming alive. Threatening the bridge, absolutely. That's this line, looked at what we walked on. Talk to him, yes, it's ice mouth whispering. And a monster, definitely, because it's scary. So in all of these, our answer here is all of the above. Good. And then finally, this last one, I think, is one of the harder ones. So how is the train ride being described? So the train ride is this last stanza, right? We're finally at the end. And notice how I told you guys it's chronological. You saw how the answers kind of move down the poem. So that can always help you guys if you're stuck on a question. You can use the question above it and the question below it to kind of sandwich your way in and realize the answer has to be somewhere in the middle. So since we're at the last question, we kind of know that our answer is going to be somewhere towards us here. And the train ride is what's connecting them to this like freezing cold city, to his home, his furthest unshoveled corner, his house all the way at the end, right? So the train is kind of the connecting point between these two separate entities or two worlds, exactly. So that's exactly what choice C is saying. Now, if we look at the options to kind of help us with process of elimination, it's not endless, right? Because they get home and it's not necessarily scary. It's kind of like that's where they were headed, right? It's kind of that was the goal to get to the train. So I wouldn't describe it as scary. And I wouldn't really call it boring, but brief either. It sounded rather long and not boring. The train was groaning, moaning. He was counting down the steps. So it didn't sound like he was just really bored out of his mind, mundane. And again, terrifying, I would eliminate same way as we eliminated scary. So I think the hardest one to eliminate is across the suburbs. There's just no evidence for this. It seems like his house might be somewhere in the suburbs, not necessarily across the suburbs. If anything, I would say it's more being described as like across the city, like past the city. So the best option here is C. All right, do you guys have any questions for me on this poem or just in general? Yeah, excellent. So just again, I'm going to put my email in here in case you guys want to send me an email asking for the notes. I can reply back with the notes. I can't send like a mass thing of all the notes because this class is open to whoever. So I don't have like a list of emails. So if you want the notes right after this, just email me and I'll reply in a few minutes with a PDF of these notes. And then other than that, this is basically how we'll run the remainder of the classes. So I'll see you guys tomorrow evening and Thursday evening. Tomorrow, we're going to work out of the same exact test. And we're going to work on the math section. And then on Thursday, we're going to do an essay section, okay? So if you guys don't have any questions, you're free to go. If you guys do have questions, I'm going to stick around for the next 10 minutes or so and answer all of your questions. Somebody said, what is the difference in difficulty between Queller Prep curriculum and Hunter test? So this test that we're working out of is actually a real released Hunter exam. So this is the difficulty that you guys can expect. In my opinion, the Queller Prep curriculum is a little bit difficult, and that's designed like that on purpose. So you guys are prepared, beyond prepared, above and beyond prepared for this exam. But this is the difficulty that I think that you should expect because this test is real and released by Hunter. I hope that answers your question. Anybody else? Any questions? So tomorrow we're going to work out of math using these same notes. The same exam. I'm going to try to do some strategies as well. If you guys have any topics, whoever is left on the class right now that you want to throw into the chat that you know you're weak on in math, that you want me to sort of prepare tomorrow, I'm more than happy to do that as well. If you guys can think of anything that you know you're weak at. So somebody said how to do problems quickly, like time management. Sure. We can touch on that tomorrow. Any specific like topics like algebra or geometry, how to solve equations, circle problems, anything specific that you guys need help with, you can put into the chat as well. Okay, volume formulas, geometry. Okay, so we can do some notes on that. All right. Okay, so if you guys don't have any other questions, I'll see you guys tomorrow, and I'll keep in mind these topics for the lesson tomorrow. I don't understand how to find the better. I'm not sure what that means. Oh, the better. Okay, so when you're stuck between two answers. Okay. All right, so we can do that tomorrow as well. Okay, guys, if there's no other questions, I'm gonna end the session now. I'll see you all tomorrow. Bye. Thank you, guys. Have a good night.